Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Reed and PwC webinar on tackling Brexit and the economy. I couldn't really think of two more bigger challenges that we have at the moment, other than obviously COVID, but we will touch on that. So I'm Mike Jones. I'm the Senior Regional Director. I've been with Reed for 15 years, and probably like most of you, this has definitely been the toughest one of those years I've ever experienced. But well done for navigating your way through it to everyone. I'm very sure we're through the very worst of it, and I'm sure that Shalena and Nick are going to give us some really positive news to take away from this. So I am delighted to be joined by Shalena Poffenberger, who is the leader for PwC's Beyond Brexit programme, and also Nick Forrest, who is the leader of their UK economics programme. So before we move on to questions with the panelists, I just wanted to state that Reed are still here. We're still going strong. We've navigated this pandemic incredibly well. As an employee of Reed, I feel like I've been really well looked after, so thank you to the heads of business. And I just want you to know that if you're looking for work or if you're looking to recruit someone, we are still very much here and very, very much willing and looking forward to helping you. It's definitely been a strange time, to say the least, and recruitment's a really good barometer of market confidence. So I thought I'd just give you a quick snippet that we're back to around about 75 to 80% of pre-lockdown activity. And we definitely saw a boost from the hope of the vaccine, with perm jobs spiking significantly this week. So very positive from my part, but that's enough from me. You've come to listen to the experts from PwC. So we already have several questions from registered attendees, which I'm going to go through with Nick and Shalena. But if you have any questions throughout, pop them on the Q&A session. You are all muted at the moment, but please feel free to get involved in that chat community, and we'll pick up those questions at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to move on to Nick first. So Nick, we are in the grips of a second wave. So what is the potential impact of that on the economy?
Thank you, Mike, and good afternoon, everyone. Great to be on this WebEx with you. So yeah, the impact of the economy. November is going to be yet another bump, but it feels like this year has been a twisty year of ups and downs for the economy. We've had to redo our scenarios about 5 times during the course of the year as the pandemic has evolved. And I'm sure as businesses you've had to do the same, constantly adjusting to the evolution of the pandemic. Before I look at November, let's just look back very quickly. So the lockdown measures in April were clearly a massive constraint to the economy. From top to bottom, the economy shrunk by a quarter. That's a massive shrinkage. But it then rebounded really quickly through the summer. And it's quite important to note that the economy can rebound fast once these lockdown measures are removed and we get on top of the virus. It was a strong rebound. What we then saw was it slowed down a bit. So August only had 2.1% of growth. In September, today's figures, you had 1.1. And in September, actually, quite a lot of that was driven by education and the health. So the private sector was slowing down a little bit. And this is the profile of the recovery we always expected. It's what we call a kinked V. It starts quite quickly, but then it slows down. That last bit of recovery, I think, does take longer due to the longer term effects of the pandemic. And that's before November. We hope that the only measures would be more social, but actually they've had to be sort of full national lockdown, so far bigger economic effects. But we don't think it's going to be as big as the first wave. If we just look at unwinding those sectors that grew in the summer, so hospitality, leisure, some of the transport sectors, they're worth about 5% of growth. So we might get a dip of 5% in a month. That's 2 to 3% over the quarter. So nothing like as much the impact of the first wave. If we're talking letters of the alphabet, it was a V. We're now looking at more like a W, but it's a very wobbly W with a far smaller second drop. So that's how I think November's going to hit. When I look at other fast data that economists like to look at, like mobility data and retail data, that kind of data and electricity consumption and transport, so it's showing that actually it's not likely to be as big an impact as the first wave. That's what I think the impact will be on the economy for November. Excellent.
Thank you, Nick. The next question we had, and I don't know if you've really touched on it, like within that question, was how does the economic recovery look? So if you've got more to add to that, then please do. If not, I'll move on to the next question.
Yes, that's kind of the here and the now. Then in terms of next year, the question is how much will recovery be next year? I think the summer has taught us that once we get out of lockdown measures, and we get on top of this pandemic, hopefully through the good positive news of a vaccine, the economy can recover fast. So I think we'll very quickly get back to around 95% of where we were pre-lockdown in quite short order by the early half of next year. I think the last bit does take a while. So there are some sectors like airlines, parts of hospitality, that will take a longer time to recover as consumers do slowly adjust back. But I think by the end of next year, we should be within 2 or 3 percentage points of where we were pre-COVID. And then the following year, we should reach that peak. Now, that would be a quicker recovery than many other recessions. Even though this has been so deep, it'll still be quite a quick recovery. It took 2 or 3 years to recover from both the financial crisis, the 90s recession, the 80s recession. So even that pace of recovery will be relatively quick. But I think that's what we've seen in the summer months. Quick recovery. I think there is some pent-up demand in the economy and consumers. So I think that bodes well. There could well be bumps. Of course, there could be other setbacks in the pandemic. We might touch on unemployment rising and how that has a reducing effect on the economy too. But that's my sort of profile for recovery for next year.
Thanks, Nick. That's really positive. And you kind of dovetails nicely into the next question. So what is the potential impact on unemployment, and what does it mean for wages and apprenticeships?
So that's the big uncertainty for economists, the effect on the labour market, unemployment. Of course, thus far, the effects have been relatively contained by the furlough scheme. So unemployment did rise, went up to 4.8% most recently, about 300,000 additional unemployed. So the strain of the COVID virus on business is impacting unemployment, undoubtedly, and that will continue to happen for the next quarter at least. So the question is, how far will it go? And unemployment topped out after the global financial crisis at 8.4%. So still got a long way to go to that point. And most commentators, Bank of England, think it'll only get to 7 or 8%. But the UK labour market has serially overperformed. We've had more jobs than we thought. We've always been surprised by the amount of employment in the UK economy. And I think that could happen again. And I think as long as the furlough scheme, the extended one, does what it's supposed to and is successful, the longer companies can work their way through this crisis, then we may avoid that huge increase in unemployment. But some rise is absolutely inevitable.
And how about with the wages and the apprenticeships?
So wage levels haven't really shifted much. They're still getting up a small amount. I mean, that's partly because the impact of COVID is so sectoral. There are some sectors that have been quite well insulated from the effect of COVID. Some have been absolutely terribly affected. Hospitality, leisure, transport being the obvious examples. So I think in a lot of sectors, the average wages are not going up quickly, but they're not kind of falling away either. It's a bit of a mirror to inflation. So I don't see this recession being a recession around inflation or wages. It's more of an economic activity recession. That's why it can come back quickly. So I imagine wage pressures will be subdued, but they won't be in falling territory.
Thanks, Nick. And yeah, certainly from the work we do, we've noticed that there's been very little shift in salaries at all, actually. So I'd certainly back that up. Okay, so we've started talking about the economy and inflation, deflation. So how will all of this affect inflation, deflation? What impact will it have on interest rates? I think as homeowners, we're all interested in that one. And what will be the arising behaviours from any action in this area?
Thanks, Mike. So on inflation, so inflation did fall. It's kind of hard to measure inflation if you think about it, when it was hard to buy goods in the shops. So it's a tough job for the Office of National Statistics. The inflation did fall a little bit. We didn't go into deflationary territory. It was it got close to zero, but not much below that, and has now been sort of creeping up through the summer and helped a bit out by the Eat Out to Help Out scheme. So we're currently at 0.7% for CPI. November may well be another little dip down, but then I think it will recover back to sort of 2%. These aren't huge swings in the grand scheme of things for inflation. In fact, in the global financial crisis, we saw bigger swings in inflation around that time. So as I said, it's not really a recession around inflation, and prices aren't moving that much in aggregate terms. Of course, there's variation between different products, essential products, some key in demand items, more discretionary items with less demand. But actually, in overall terms, it's not been a recession around inflation. So what does that mean for interest rates? Well, the Bank of England have been very accommodative in this this period, both with setting very low interest rates, very close to zero, and more quantitative easing, so buying up more government bonds. That's with the aim of getting inflation back to 2% over the sort of 12, 18-month period, and that's the broad market expectation. So I don't think inflation or interest rates are doing much different to what they have done in the past. We've now been used to an era of low interest rates, and that's down even more so. So I think the behaviours off the back of that will be very similar to what they have been in the past. Low interest rates, a more easy financing situation. What we have to worry about is that actually with low interest rates and with the increase in debt that many companies have had to take on, is what that means for the future, and were interest rates to rise, what that means for debt service and those companies. So, but they're all issues I think for quite a long way down the track. So I don't expect interest rates to rise anytime soon. But that's the one of the behavioural consequences is more debt and potential risks further down the line.
Okay, and we might come on to that topic again then in one of the later questions about the long-term impacts. But let's take a detour into what's going on in the world. So how has or will the American election, COVID, Brexit, and ESG affect the economic recovery?
Thanks. So I think what's happened in the last few months is a lot of people realise that there's more going on than COVID, and I think economists like myself and businesses were very focused on COVID throughout the early part of the pandemic, and I think we realise now that actually there's lots of risks out there to assess and to look at. American elections, the end of transition, also the changing attitudes around green and ESG, to name a few. So I think it's the movement to a sort of multi-risk world that we need to get used to, not all about COVID. And I think we did a little bit sort of forget about what was going on with transition, which Shalena will talk about in a moment. So with that in mind, multiple risks on the horizon. Many of these are quite short term. I think American elections, we now had them. COVID and vaccine, end of transition, they are very short term. So I think by end of Q1 next year, we could be in a very different place with those three risks. We may or may not have a good outcome from the end of transition. The US political system might have gone down a bit, and we may make good progress on the pandemic. So the risk outlook is changing. How does it affect the economy? Well, COVID is by far the biggest impact. So that's the one to focus on. The American election, not a great deal, I don't think. I think Joe Biden will, I think, bring in a bigger fiscal package to fight the pandemic and the economic recovery. That'll be very sectorally based: infrastructure, green, social policy. That might benefit certain sectors. But from a trade perspective in the US, I don't see huge change from that. I think Europe and COVID are far more important than the UK. I'll come back to Brexit maybe after Shalena's told us more about what's going to happen there. On ESG, I think that affects the nature of the recovery. I think the government really wants to kind of build back better and build back greener, build back differently. So I think both policy action around taxes and infrastructure spending and green initiatives, I think will determine the nature of the recovery. I think businesses need to really think about how they are playing into that type of recovery. Both governments and investors, I think, are really looking for that. There's ESG credentials all the way down to medium-sized and smaller businesses. So it's that really going to drive the nature of the recovery.
Okay, thanks, Nick. And then we kind of touched on it, and we're hearing a lot in the news from a health perspective about long COVID. And I guess this question arises from, if there's long COVID in a health perspective, what's the long COVID in the business world? So what are the longer term impacts of COVID-19?
Thanks. So I think there will be lots of long-term impacts from COVID, but actually it's not that COVID's necessarily going to change the world. COVID's in many respects going to make the world come quicker. It's going to accelerate the trends that we were already having, and they're just going to arrive faster. So for example, the switch to digital, whether that's for consumers who, once you've learned Zoom, you can't unlearn Zoom. If it's businesses who have, a lot of our clients have implemented digital programs in far quicker time than they would have done sort of absent COVID. So I think COVID has accelerated the trend towards digitalization. It's accelerated the need for resilience. Think about the financial sector. A lot of work was done post the financial crisis to improve resilience. that's largely been very successful with increased capital and the role of the financial services sector in the economy. But I think that goes wider now when you look at resilience all the way across supply chains, businesses in terms of how they meet these type of shocks. We talked about kind of the environmental and kind of that being accelerated in terms of the need for action on environment, climate change, green and broader issues. Thinking about global situations, so Asia has had a far better pandemic, far least worst pandemic than the UK, Europe and America. So I think the influence of China and Asia in the world is going to grow. That's both an opportunity in terms of a large market, but it does bring challenges in terms of we're living in a more sort of fractured world, and careful selection of alliances, joint venture partners between the US and China, for example, does need to be thought through by business. And then lastly, on a trend accelerator, sadly, social inequalities only grown during this crisis. So the government's going to have to double down on levelling up and that agenda. Real change on apprenticeships, access to opportunities for young people, and wider social policy. So all those things were happening anyway. I just think COVID's kind of increased the sort of pace at which they're going to arrive, and we'll have to react to them. There are some long-term factors that are harder to call, though. Consumer behaviour is tricky. Early on in the crisis, surveys suggested that a lot of consumers, 20-25%, wouldn't consider flying even after this is all over, or wouldn't consider going to certain events. Now it's challenging on some of those surveys. So I tend to think that when you ask consumers what they think in the middle of a crisis, it's hard to picture what life's going to be like when it's all over. So I think some consumer behaviours will revert to how they were before. I remember after the financial crisis, when the savings rate went up massively, and a lot of people thought, great, we've now learned how to save again. But we quickly forgot that, went back to our consuming ways. So I think some things will go back around consumers. I think the hardest one to call is the use of offices, the working environment, and urban centres. And we've done a report recently on the impact to the economy of the commuter economy. So all the commuters going into particularly urban centres, whether that's big cities around the UK or London, and that loss of economic activity through working from home, essentially, particularly in the office environment. I think offices will have to change and become more flexible, adaptable, and people will work in a more adaptable way. But I don't think it means we're not going to go back to the office again. And certainly in our organisation, we've been really helping our teams and our staff get back into the office safely, where they can collaborate, be creative, and all those sort of interactions you miss in the thing around each other. So I think those two trends are harder to call, but I think a lot of the first one I mentioned about accelerating sort of the world's change, is very much what's going to come out of it.
Lovely, thanks, Nick. A lot of what you said there really resonated with me in terms of what we're looking with our office portfolio, learning how to save again, and definitely forgetting how to save very, very quickly. I can certainly say that, but I wouldn't include myself in that 25% who won't fly. As soon as it's safe to do so, I am going on holiday. However, we've had some great questions, which we'll come on to at the end, but that does turn our attention to Brexit now, because perhaps Brexit will change the way in which we do travel, and I'm sure we'll come on to that, Shalena. But if I can just start from a more of a business perspective with Brexit. So where do trade negotiations stand right now, and do you have an indication of what the outcome might be?
Yes, so at the moment, we've gone through, several kind of cliff edges, deadlines, hard stops that they've all come and gone. So Brexit negotiations are continuing. Negotiators were in London this week. There's will on both sides to come to an agreement. The holdouts in the negotiations are specifically around fishing and state aid. The main thing to point out here is that time is really running out. So any treaty would have to be translated into each of the EU 27 languages and approved by all of the EU nations and the UK via legislative processes. So it won't just happen overnight. So we may be looking at a scenario where we stop negotiations, trade with the EU on WTO rules for a period of time, maybe a year, and then go back to the negotiating table in the new year to try again. We may also be looking at a scenario where we come to a trade agreement in the last hour, and then the the people who are the negotiating teams have to work very hard to get the legal text translated and get them through legislative processes by the end of the year. Either way, it's going to be highly disruptive. The alternative is that we walk away where we're angry with each other and we make border processes as difficult as possible for one another. So it's important that we do continue to come to the table and try to get past the differences that we have in terms of negotiating. There cannot, by law, be another extension. So there will be an entirely new trading relationship regardless of FTA negotiations from the 1st of January.
Okay, and yeah, so I guess key question would be what would the differences be between an FTA and a no trade deal for businesses?
Yeah, so in terms of movement of goods, because that's entirely what an FTA is really wrapped up in. So the processes for moving goods, if there's a free trade agreement or if there's no free trade agreement, does not change. So customs declarations will be required for all goods that are moving between the UK and the EU and between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So each of these border crossings triggers a customs declaration. The only difference in the trade deal is whether a tariff is also applied or if we're trading tariff free. So if your Brexit preparations would be the same no matter what the FTA outcome would be. On customs declarations, every single shipment requires a declaration and includes data fields such as country of origin that haven't had to be captured before. So you'll need to update your systems to capture the data, upskill your staff on rules for customs processing, and prepare for the volume of customs declarations that will change overnight. It's estimated that the UK alone will generate 215 million declarations per year from the 1st of January, which is up from 30 million today. And last month, HMRC wrote to all VAT registered businesses recommending that they appoint a customs intermediary to take on the volume of customs declarations, a service which is estimated to have about a 50,000 person shortfall to manage that capacity. So the risk of not getting customs declarations right is inaccurately coded declarations, declarations with missing information, and failure to submit declarations at the correct time or through the right systems will all potentially significantly interrupt supply chains and could lead to HMRC penalties. So not getting this right means your goods may get turned away at the border, your trucks can't enter Kent, and you definitely cannot be delivered on time. So supply chains that have been optimized for speed and fluidity would need to find the space and the time for customs authorities to carry out checks and inspections. And additionally, it's not just your ability to manage these processes, but it's your suppliers, their suppliers on down the line. So to quote HMRC, unless you have the correct processes, contracts, and agreements in place, you'll not be able to trade with the EU from 1st of January 2021.
Right, it just feels like it's getting really real all of a sudden, doesn't it? And there's some real tangible things that need to be done. My next question was going to be on, what does it mean for the movement of goods? But unless you feel like you've got anything else to add to that, Shalena, the next question I had was, what's the risk of not getting customs declarations right?
Yeah, so as I said, it is deep interruption to your supply chains, and we are talking primarily in this FTA about moving goods, and that includes goods moving to between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So it truly is having your goods stopped at the border, having your supply chains are delayed. You may not be able to bring in materials in time to be able to fulfill orders, and we may see some interruption in kind of the grocery store shelves. In the UK, in terms of fresh produce, we import a lot of our goods, particularly in the winter, which is when Brexit will be ending. So there really is a significant risk of disruption to that movement of goods. Okay,
and obviously we talked a lot about the movement of goods there. So the next big one is people. So moving on to the movement of people, what do firms need to do to prepare for the new UK immigration system?
Yep. So the new UK immigration system comes into effect on the 1st of January, and it is not subject to negotiations. So we've known for some time what the new UK immigration system involves, and employing EU nationals without settled status will come with the same requirements as employing individuals from the rest of the world. So in terms of impact, there's two categories here. There's firms who are already licensed to sponsor employment visas and those who aren't. So employing EU nationals without settled status will come with the same requirements as employing individuals from the rest of the world. For those that are already licensed, the volume of visa processing will increase significantly, as well as the cost of their global workforce working in the UK or the EU. So firms who are not already registered to sponsor work visas will need to do so ASAP. There's a 4-month lead time in application processing just for the business to become licensed to sponsor visas. It also costs on average about £9,000 to employ a non-UK national, and visa processing times can really vary. So these firms will need to be prepared for an increased volume of visa processing, additional costs, and additional time required to carry out those processes. The other key area with respect to the new immigration system is business travel. So from 1st of January, UK nationals will need permission to travel to the EU for work purposes. So going to meetings, training, conferences will largely not need a permit, but travel for the purpose of carrying out your normal duties, such as machinery installation, building safety inspections, or even lorry drivers crossing the border with their shipment will all need a work permit. So the rules are different for each and every EU 27 country, and the lead times are different and the cost for visa processing. So this delay and the additional costs will need to be factored into your normal operations.
Okay, so we've talked about goods and people. The last bit of it is personal data and that lovely 4-letter acronym GDPR that we all love. Can you explain what the risks are here, please, Shalena?
Yeah, absolutely. So GDPR adequacy is an agreement that's not part of the FTA, but the outcome is wrapped up with the trade negotiations. So it's one of those decisions that are being withheld until after the trade negotiations have been carried out. So this will impact the legality of personal data moving from the EU into the UK. And we're seeing that data privacy and data protection considerations are a gap in many organizations' Brexit preparations. It's just one we hadn't quite thought about. So a key point for people to understand is that the GDPR prevents data moving from the EU to the UK unless that transfer is covered by an adequacy decision or an appropriate safeguard or exceptions. So without this, personal data cannot legally leave the EU. So after some recent rulings, it's looking unlikely that adequacy will be granted, or at least it won't be granted before the end of the transition period. And if this remains the case, at the end of the transition period, the UK will become a third country, and businesses will need to take steps to allow data flows to continue from the EU to the UK from the 1st of Jan. So in terms of getting started, you should map your personal data flows to know where the data originates, where it flows to, how it's used, who's using it. Specifically, you'll need to be able to identify the personal data that moves from the EU into the UK and determine which of these data flows would cause risk to your business if they're interrupted or halted. So with special consideration given to personal data flows with your customers, with your suppliers, and other group entities, all personal data is affected. After that, you'll need to assess the contractual provisions you already have in place for these data flows. Outside of that, you should review and update your privacy notices, your contracts, DPIAs, and other relevant documentation. So for instance, to change references from EU to UK law, and to determine whether you'll need to appoint an EEA representative or identify a new EU lead supervisory authority.
Okay, thanks, Shalena. So last question for you before we move back to Nick. What would be your final words of advice that you'd leave us with?
Yeah, so I would say that irrespective of what happens in the trade negotiations, change is coming. The transition period will not be extended. And with just 31 working days left to the end of the transition, time is really running out. So your final preparations for the end of transition should be very well underway. So deal or no deal, you have to be prepared to move goods, people, and data differently than you do today.
Okay. Thanks, Shalena. Yeah, we've got some work to do, haven't we?
Indeed.
So Nick, back to you then. So just before we move on to the Q&A with the audience, which we've got a few questions in there, so thank you. Can you look into your crystal ball, give us an outlook for 2021, and what 3 things should businesses be doing now to prepare for the economy next year?
Thanks, Mike. So 3 things from me. So 1, prepare for the upswing, 2, prepare for accelerated change, and 3, prepare for big government. What I mean by that is, I think, I do think once we get through the pandemic, through vaccines, or generally get on top of it, through the end of transition, and a slightly more stable global environment, I think there's the ingredients there for an upswing. Now there may be bumps along the way, of course, but I think businesses do need to be prepared for that and not caught out by it. So that's the sort of view for next year. As I say, if we can go from where we are now to being 2 or 3 percentage points below peak by the end of the year, that will be a growing year and a recovery year. So prepare for that. Secondly, prepare for accelerated change. So I think the themes I talked about, whether that's green or social policy or digitalization, all those longer term trends, I think prepare for that continued rate of change. And then lastly, prepare for big government. So not normally associated with a Conservative government, but I think the role of the government through the pandemic, of course, has had a far bigger role than we normally have in the economy. I don't think that's going to go away. We might touch on that in questions. The government's going to have to continue providing support, but looking to extract itself. And then it'll be looking at these policies around green, around social policies. So I think the role of business and government will have to be closer than it probably has been in previous eras, both together achieving government's aims, but also just the nature of interaction between companies and governments. So prepare for those 3 things.
Thanks, Nick. And I am really, really positive there. I think it's nice to attend a webinar where there's some positive rhetoric about the future, because we've been through the mill this year. So I'm definitely looking forward to an upswing. So thank you. We've got some really good questions. So I'll direct this one at you, Shalena, but Nick, feel free to jump in because it does border both topics. So this is from Anonymous, but this is a question that we very much discussed in the business here. So whilst COVID has impacted the economy, businesses and colleagues significantly, do you feel it's actually reduced the staffing risk of Brexit, with more talent in the job market and more EEA nationals now deciding to stay in the UK?
Yeah, and actually this has been a really interesting outcome of COVID. So we definitely feel like there's probably more more depth in the job market than there might have been without COVID in terms of Brexit. So in the early days of Brexit, and particularly in certain sectors like financial services, we did see a huge exodus of EU nationals leaving the UK to go back to their respective countries, whether their companies were moving them back or whether it was a personal decision that was happening. Now, what we're seeing in the later stages of Brexit, and particularly after COVID, there's more available workforce, and we're seeing kind of the government programs to try to retrain people into new and different fields, particularly as we move into kind of a more digital delivery kind of environment. We do think that there is kind of additional scope or additional bandwidth within the UK job market already. I think the main point that we want to make sure to point out is that it will become slightly more complicated, and it will become slightly more expensive to employ EU nationals who don't already have settled status in the UK.
Okay, thank you. Nick, do you have anything to add to that? We've definitely got a question for you next, though.
Oh, well, thanks. So on Brexit, so I think originally in 2016, I guess it was, we looked at sort of the 5 channels of Brexit impact on the economy. That included sort of migration and labour, but also business investment, general uncertainty, sort of taxation, regulation, and then trade and tariffs. And a lot of those impacts are probably going to be far less than we thought. I think the labour market has got more slack. I think business investment lower anyway. Doesn't make it good, but it's a lower base, so it can't be impacted much. So I think the important thing about Brexit is actually the trades and the tariffs impact. That's the one that I think is still there and unresolved at this point in time. We had an impact back in 2016 of about 1.7% on GDP. And it's important to say that I think whilst that will be mitigated, I think, by some of the progress that's been made, it does impact very different companies. So the impact on COVID has been very much the hospitality, leisure and service industries. The impact of Brexit, if we don't get a kind of agreement, will be on traded goods. So it's a different kind of sectors that are going to be impacted through Brexit. But even that 1.7% figure is far smaller than anything from COVID. So I think Brexit, in comparison, is still a smaller issue, albeit disruptive and coming at a really unfortunate time.
Okay, thanks. And this one's definitely for you, Nick. So this is from Howard. So what options do you think the Chancellor has to balance the UK economic books? There's talk in the press today of changes to capital gains tax, but that will only go so far.
So let me look at kind of when does he need to balance the books. So I don't think the taxation question needs to be answered straight away. And I don't think we're going to go anywhere like the sort of the austerity years from the following the global financial crisis. So I think this does have to be resolved through taxation, but it doesn't need to be resolved immediately. Low interest rates mean that a lot of the debts can be paid off over a long period of time. But there's still maybe coming out of this a structural deficit that needs to be fixed, and a plan for a roadmap for how to balance the books and bring the debt levels down over time. How is he going to do that? Well, I think no one tool is big enough. So it's going to have to be quite a broad range of tools. I think so wealth I think will be part of it, but I think capital gains is more likely than anything more specific. I think companies will have to bear a higher burden of taxation. I think the support mechanisms have been very much directed at companies, and I think Rishi Sunak wants to sort of say, "Oh, we've supported business during the pandemic. There'll have to be some payback." So even though the Conservative government have really tried to bring down the rate of corporation tax, I just don't see that kind of pressure being there. And I think globally those rates probably won't come down like they have been. So I think the corporates will pay a fair share. Digital businesses and those that have done well out of the crisis are obviously going to be in line for possible taxation increases, but it'll have to be broad as well. So even things like sort of VAT, which are very broad in impact, and actually do have detrimental impacts on lower income groups. But it needs to be a broad brush taxation response. But it won't be until we get through the crisis and get the economy back to where it was.
Okay. Thank you, Nick. This one, I suppose, could be answered by either, but I'll go to you first, Shalena. So this is from Tahir. Will the UK lose its special status with the US so that France and Germany are provided by a Biden US, meaning the UK becomes less relevant or important?
Yeah, so I think Nick will have some to add on this, but as an American, what I can say is that the special relationship between the UK and the US has transcended governments over many, many years. So regardless of who's in power on either side, that relationship has remained very close. Economically, the US has often seen the UK as its gateway to Europe, a culture which it doesn't always understand. And I think that, a Biden presidency versus a Trump presidency will be much less nationalistic. So there's much less support for Brexit Britain in a Biden presidency. So you'll see, as you've seen in the press, I'm sure you'll see that Biden will be intensely focused on ensuring that the provisions of the Northern Ireland Protocol continue to protect peace on the island of Ireland, and to ensure that there remains no border on the island of Ireland as well. But in terms of economics, I might want to pass over to Nick on this one.
Thanks. Yeah, I totally agree, Shalena. I think we've got to be careful about overstating some of the kind of impacts of these while they are big events. Let's not overstate them. I think there are lots of reasons why the UK has been successful in a whole range of industries, culture, language, all those sort of inherent features of the UK that aren't changing. And I think after Brexit, I think there's the warning of hundreds of thousands of bankers leaving the UK, going to Europe, and the City of London would be nothing like what it was before. But actually, the City of London has ridden through plenty of storms before, and it goes for other industries too. So I think that special relationship will continue. I think some of these events, while significant, don't change some of those very ingrained long-term relationships.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, now this one again, I think the Brexit and the economic discussion overlap so much, don't they? So I'm happy to be led by you guys on this. So a question from Ashvin. One of the shifts in behaviour due to COVID is the onshoring of activities, for example, the production of PPE kits by local firms. Will this kind of behaviour, combined with Brexit, be a major boost for the UK economy? You want to go first and then maybe defer to Nick after?
I was going to defer to Nick, but no, I think I definitely think there are opportunities within Brexit, and there are, there's risks and there's opportunities, and I think, we will make the very best of it that we possibly can. Labor in Great Britain is more expensive than it is in other places, so I think we will continue to be importers. However, we'll find a way to manage the additional costs of doing business across the border with the EU. And one thing I do want to remember that the focus right now is on that UK and EU trading relationship. We are also negotiating new trading relationships with many other countries around the world, and some of those in more favorable terms than we did already have with the EU. So there's going to be opportunities coming from all directions. But as for the economy, I must defer to the expert.
Thanks, Shalena. So I think this is a tricky one, isn't it? I think through the crisis, we've definitely seen reshoring activity coming back, and some of that was an existing trend. Sort of peak trade, global trade was a few years ago. Actually, trade growth has been below global growth in the last few years. So the trends in global trade, as countries become more even and more balanced, some of those big trading flows have slowed somewhat. So I think that was a trend that was in place. It would carry on. I think resilience of supply chains versus perfect, globally optimized, efficient supply chains. We swung too far one way. We realized we need to come back a bit in terms of resilience terms. So I think absolutely that's a trend. I think is here to stay. I think it is a trade-off, though. I think there are benefits from global trade. I think this specialization in what different countries can do and produce does bring economic benefits to the world, but it's also had a downside in terms of global trade, in terms of some of the inequalities it's produced. So I think we move towards a world that is not so dominated by some of those trading imbalances. Many things will be produced more locally, which is an opportunity for firms in those sectors. But economically, there may be a little bit of a compromise in there.
Excellent, thanks, Nick. And then I've got two final questions, which are both going to be for you, Shalena. So, is it compulsory that every organisation has to register for sponsorship, or is it just for the organisations that wish to sponsor individuals who hold EU nationality?
So it's compulsory for every organisation who wishes to employ non-UK nationals to register for visa sponsorship. From 1st of January, that group will include EU nationals, whereas today it doesn't. Hopefully that's clear.
Okay, and then the final one, what is the justification for the EU not giving the UK an adequacy decision, given that GDPR has been implemented in the UK already?
Yeah, so logically you would think that we've already implemented GDPR in the UK, and therefore we just roll that over to an adequacy agreement. With the GDPR, each of the EU 27, or I guess 28, including us, nations, implemented the GDPR with their local supervisory authorities. The EU had generally, on certain occasions, had taken issue with the way that GDPR has been implemented in the UK. So there have been a number of court cases and certainly some decisions that have been made that the EU had thought that the UK hadn't gone quite far enough. The UK itself may wish to roll back some of those data privacy provisions as well, because the GDPR is considered to be extraordinarily stringent. So it's not completely agreed. It's not completely done. It may change. It may not. There has been very, very little said on the topic, but when I speak to my colleagues who are data privacy professionals, data privacy lawyers, they're all pretty skeptical that we're going to get an adequacy agreement, at least not before the end of the year, and without having to give something up on our own.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you, Shalena and Nick. I think excellent panelists. Thank you to everyone who's attended. My takeaways from this is there's definitely some stuff that people need to be doing right now to be ready for Brexit. And really importantly, there's lots of reasons to be hopeful and positive about next year. And after this year, I think we all deserve it, don't we? So thank you very much to Nick and Shalena. Thank you to everyone for attending. I'm going to finish by saying this, and I know it's November, but if I don't speak to you before, have a very good Christmas, everyone. This is a time we should really enjoy with our loved ones. So enjoy that. May I wish you all a really fruitful 2021. And don't forget, if you're looking for work or looking to recruit, you couldn't do anything better than call Reed. So thank you all for attending, and take care and stay safe and stay happy. Thank you.